Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming tonight and for staying for our discussion. So tonight we want to sort of discuss with you ideas about how technology is changing the way that theatre is distributed, the way that we think about making theatre and the different ways in which we engage with theatre. So it's a real pleasure for me tonight to have with me David Sabel from the National Theatre, Matt Adams from Blast Theory, and Tassos Stevens from Coney. So I'm just going to start with a question to you, David. So could you just tell us a little bit about the ways in which you use technology in your work at the National Theatre?
Thanks. So I'm the Director of Broadcast and Digital at the National Theatre, and my department covers a number of different ways in which we engage with technology. And I mean, it's the danger of talking about technology or talking about digital is that it can mean so many different things, and so it's, in some ways it's a really unhelpful term. But primarily my area is around content production and distribution. So a major part of the department is National Theatre Live, or NT Live, which people are possibly familiar with, which broadcasts a series of live productions from the National, but also now from other theatres around the UK, and even we've just done our first American production and broadcast them to cinemas around the world, and that's grown to be a very successful program. So it's using satellite and broadcast technology to take those productions live out to cinema, and are now also repeated. But then another part of the department is looking much more at website development, app development, and interactivity, and so where digital technology can open up ways for people to engage with us who may not physically be present, or who might be physically present front of house, but ways of engaging outside of the actual theatre spaces. And there's a link to the National Theatre Studio where new work is workshopped and developed. So we are also, a strand of our work is more R&D based and looking at what a lot of these guys do, which is looking at new ways of telling stories and new ways of making theatre using different kinds of technology. And then another, sort of the third strand of the department is very much about learning. So it's about trying to reach not only schools, although that's a huge part of it, but actually sort of lifelong learning and people who have an interest in the themes of the production, in the craft of making theatre, because the National, everything is made on site, so we do a lot of work about sort of what happens behind the scenes, trying to open that up a bit more. So those are the sort of three key strands of my department.
Matt, would you like to tell us a little bit about the ways in which you used digital technologies in your work at Blast Theory?
Sure, hello. I'm an artist and a theatre maker. And Blast Theory is a group of 3 artists, and we make work, we've been making work with technology for about 20 years. And my interest in that is because of the way in which technology is changing society, and because there is a complete transformation in the ways in which people interact and participate with the world around them and with culture in general. And so in Blast Theory we use mobile technology often. We make work on the street, online, for apps, in all kinds of different spaces, but always the through line is about looking for a performative moment that's sitting at the heart of that. It's nearly always live, the work we make. So we're trying to think about how you could stretch theatre to its outer limits to constantly have that live moment, and to think about how you can allow people to interact in the fullest degree. So my sort of feeling is that there is an opportunity to create a theatrical experience in all kinds of different settings, and we try and take as bigger risks as we can to do that.
And Tassos, if you could tell us a little bit about Coney and your work with technology.
Hello, thanks for being here. So I'm on a Coney, and we make work which is all about the audience and puts them at the heart of it and gives them scope to play, if they choose, interactive, immersive kind of words that can be applied to some of the work. It's very, very different. The most important thing about technology is really that the technology is not that important. It's a toolbox, and what it enables, and I think when we talk about digital technology, what we really mean is about the ability to be able to connect to people when they're not in the same room as you, and when they're not necessarily in the same time, like in sync with you, and to have live, by live I mean responsive kind of conversations or play kind of with them wherever they are. And what this then enables, something I'm working on at the moment, which is kind of a sort of relatively extreme example, is a piece called Adventure One of A Tale of Two Cities, which is an adventure which happens somewhere in the financial district of London. I can't tell you where because it's a secret location because we don't have permission for real. And we wouldn't get permission if we asked for it. And the experience of the audience, first of all, like the kind of, the box office is online, and people sign up online, and we release information to them only when they've gone a certain distance through, so that the kind of both the location and the precise times and dates are not released publicly. You start about a week before the date of the adventure, when you'll be in an online exchange with an associate of ours called Josh, who will ask you various questions, and opens up what it's about, and also kind of the way that you're going to be experiencing it, because you are using your phone, and you're playing in public, well, it's not actually public space, but in a way in which nobody who's not playing can tell that you're playing. So you're trying to blend in. So your phone also then becomes a prop, because all around you, everybody like out in the streets, might be, the easiest way to stop in the middle and look a bit weird is to put your phone in front of you. Like that enables that. And you are being texted, and there's an interactive platform that we've built that enables, so if you send like a keyword, it will respond, your phone might ring, a phone box might ring. You've also sent your playlist of tracks in advance, so that you get directed to listen to a particular track. You're in Press a Manger, and it knows that because you just told it. If you're in Press a Manger, then play this track, and something unfolds because you're listening to that in that place. And then more stuff which I can't tell you because it's an adventure. And that is not possible as an experience without the use of the phone and the internet. But that's really not what it's about. And like what it's about is both the kind of experience that we're giving people and the fact that it's actually sort of exploring all of our relationships to the financial system. And we can throw people on location, like inside the system itself, because that gives them a very different kind of experience. But that's why. And I think always it's the question of why are you using technology, what is it achieving, and how does it reach an audience? It's important. So I went on a bit.
Brilliant. Matt, I wonder if you could tell me a little bit about Karen.
I would love to tell you about Karen. So one of the things that we've tried to always do in our work is to look at how you can make the audience into the protagonist. How far could you go to allow the audience member to be the centre of an experience? And Karen is our first app, which is going to be launched in April. It's a co-commission by National Theatre Wales and Space, which is a BBC Arts Council collaboration. And Karen is a life coach who is on your phone. And when you first launch the app, she will offer to life coach you. You can chat to her, give her some information about you, and she will feed back to you things about yourself. What is not immediately clear is that in the background, the app is running a series of psychological profiling techniques on you. So as you chat to her, she is building up a picture of who you are and is adapting, not just giving you life coaching feedback, but actually the entire story is being shaped by your personality profile. So it's a work very much about how governments and corporations are gathering data on us all the time and are manipulating and processing that outside our knowledge. But also it's an experience where over a week or 10 days, you're engaging with Karen a couple of times a day for a few minutes at a time. And as you build a relationship with her, you're not entirely sure just how far she understands what you're about and to what extent you're being manipulated by that.
Excellent. Brilliant. David, I want to ask you a little bit about NT Live, because it was one of those things that when it started, I felt quite sceptical about it, because I sort of felt like every single recording I'd ever seen of a theatre production was really, it just wasn't very good. But then I actually went to one, and it was a really amazing experience. So I'm just really interested in how you sort of managed to make that such an event.
Yeah, I was really skeptical as well. So I trained as an actor originally, and when the opportunity came up to do what was initially a 2-month feasibility study on the idea of what became NT Live at the National, I took the opportunity because I wanted to work at the National, and I thought, this is a terrible idea, because film theatre is usually really poor, and it feels like it's the exact opposite of, because it makes that interactivity between the audience and the performers and the performance even more distant, and so it feels deadening to the art form. It feels quite static. So I went into it really skeptical, and I'm very glad you had a good experience. I'm converted too, and I always say to people, and we do often still have people who are, you know, approach it, who haven't seen it and might be quite purist about the form. You say, but just, you know, go and see it and try it, because I think what changed my mind and what I hope we've achieved, partly it's in the quality and the way we do it, and I can talk a little bit about that, but I think it is, and it goes back actually to what Tassos was saying, which is that it's about the audience and it's about the experience. So we don't distribute NT Live currently outside of the cinema. It's always in the cinema now. Sometimes it's no longer just live because it's repeated because of audience demand, but it's still very much a shared experience. The frame, in a way, of the stage, although we film in all different kinds of spaces, is preserved because of the big screen. And I think what changed my mind was that I went to see one of the Met Opera broadcasts because we were very much inspired by what they were the real pioneers in this space. And one of the things that changed my mind was, you know, I was walking into a cinema in London, and 5 hours earlier in Ocean Away, there was an audience walking into the auditorium of the Met Opera. And that felt incredibly exciting and connected. And there was a kind of residue on it, that even though it wasn't the same thing as being there, I was having a fantastic experience. And, you know, it was filmed very well, and HD technology, and the big screen, but it really was about the fact that it was a communal experience, I think, that people applauded at the end of these screenings, that you felt somehow connected to the performance. And then there was still a big question to us as though how you film theatre, because in some ways I think filming opera is slightly more straightforward. The storytelling tends to be much more stretched out and elongated and simpler in a way, and you tend to focus on the person who's singing or the kind of, I'm oversimplifying here, but it's very true that in theatre, you often want to be, the shot choices, there's many, many more shots in an NT Live than there are in a recording of an opera, and it always depends on the production, and filming different productions and in different spaces always poses new challenges to us. So the approach from NT Live is very much to approach each time as a new event and completely bespoke. So we hold the entire theatre off sale until we know where the best place to film this show is. And sometimes that requires a camera on stage, and sometimes that requires tracking shots, or sometimes it's a much simpler approach. But what it does is to allow us to film it in the best possible way and prioritize the audience that's going to be watching in cinemas that night, as opposed to the audience in the theatre. And we make all kinds of little tiny tweaks and adjustments, which are all about making sure that the integrity of what the creative team for the stage, for the theatre, have created is preserved. So those are the two reasons I'd say I hope that it's been a good experience.
I think I've talked quite enough, so what I'd really love to do is to open it out to you guys and to see what questions you've got for our panels and what you'd like to ask. So does anyone have a question they'd like to ask? The man in the front row.
Thank you. A lot of what you said is very exciting, and a few bits are terrifying. I mean, if you can overturn the whole banking sector by this device, I just applaud you, and you can rule the world.
I couldn't possibly comment.
I'm interested in whether you think all this sort of work changes the way people see what they experience live on stage. And the reason I ask that is that two phenomena, I think, have arisen as a result of people living more and more through their mobile phones and their screens. I'm putting aside silly things like phones on sticks and people taking photographs with really clumsy big screens instead of nice little cameras as they used to. I was in a cafe and everyone was on their phone doing stuff, and somebody just collapsed on the floor. And I don't know what's wrong with them. Somebody did call an ambulance, but quite a few people took pictures of it. And it was as if they couldn't respond to the moment that was live without somehow either seeing it through a screen or capturing it in order for others to see it through a screen. And before people had left, lots of those people had sent photo messages of that moment, a stranger collapsing on the floor in front of them, to their mates. And I thought, this is really unhealthy. But it's a phenomenon. And the other phenomenon is in galleries and museums, where I've walked out in frustration at the fact that people prefer to, not everybody obviously, but lots of people, increasing numbers of people, prefer to see paintings on the wall through a screen. And they're not happy standing in front of a Vermeer and just looking at it. They need to take a photograph of it, even though there's a much better postcard in the shop that captures the image more effectively. And I'm interested in the interactivity that both of you, or all of you talked about, because although I sort of applaud the exciting journeys you're going on with exploring the creative possibilities of using technology in that way, there's a deep disturbance underlying this phenomenon of, and I don't know what it is, people being seduced by the capacity to see the world through a small screen. That's a long question, sorry.
So I'm going to try and very briefly sum it up, so excuse me if I sort of bastardise your question in the process. So basically the question is about, are digital technologies changing the way that we interact with real objects and live events, both in the theatre but also actually just things happening in the world around us? So Matt, you've got the microphone.
Yeah, well, thank you for your question. I mean, rather than respond to your point about that social transformation, what I would say is that I see it as part of my job to get in among that change, not to deny it or pretend it's not happening. You know, it's not that long ago that it was commonplace in theatre to talk that as theatre as in opposition to electronic media. There was recorded things, bad, live things, good, and that's not you know, it's not too long ago that really was a widely held view, and productions like this are a great thing to be seeing in the West End to demonstrate that theatre can interrogate and take on some of those changes. So what I would say is, you know, I share loads of your misgivings. The answer is, and this work is a great example of those misgivings and looking at those fine lines that are, you know, those subtle philosophical questions that come into play with these new changes. So, you know, what I would say is we're trying to make work that acknowledges those changes and tries to understand the ways in which intimacy is being changed, community is being changed, trust is being changed. You know, I find it deeply disquieting that, you know, how over 1 billion people in the world relate to many of their friends is on a platform that is a privately owned system that is, you know, designed as a profit-making device in which every utterance and every form of utterance is carefully crafted according to the needs of a business rather than any social or political concerns. So, you know, it's beholden on all of us to try and make work that challenges those changes.
I agree with everything Matt said, and I'd kind of also add, I'm very interested in how the technology is landed. It's relatively recently. I mean, like, I've had that thing for 4 years, and I first got it because I made a game for it. I resisted for quite some time. Facebook, which I guess you're referring to, Matt, is like it's been around since 2007. That's less than 10 years. Like it's kind of no time, and yet the rate of change in technology, I think, is outstripping the rate of change of like etiquettes and a kind of understanding of like more than etiquette. That can be kind of politeness, but the sense of like the kinds of behaviours and what things can do, and the kinds of qualities of attention that we're paying in different contexts. But I think that will reassert itself. Like I think that we kind of learn to distinguish actually, like in this kind of space, there's certain things that are good to do and certain things that are not good to do. And then you make experiences that work for this kind of space and the kind of conventions, the contract you as audience have, like the kind of attention you want to pay. Like I don't think it's true that people have lost the art of paying attention because of the internet. It's because the people on the internet are paying attention in a very different way to people in a theatre. And he's starting to understand that, and what it's like. The danger, what you were sort of kind of describing kind of within the art gallery is in some ways how, because what this is a pervasive tool to find something which is a little bit easier to engage with than something that might be boring or hard in that moment. And I do worry that we're losing the capacity to engage with moments that might be a little bit boring. Because as an artist, I know that actually when you're working on something that feels really boring, usually the next thing that happens it goes really fucking exciting.
David, would you like to add any thoughts?
Well, I mean, I agree with both those things. I don't know that I have that much more to add, other than that, I guess, I think, there's no question that it produces both positive and negative. These phenomena are producing both positive and negative impacts, and I think people are coming to grips with it, and actually, and this play, and the fact that you are seeing more and more people questioning these anxieties, these questions in art, is, I hope, a really encouraging thing. And the one thing I'm encouraged by working in the theatre is that theatre remains in art form, which does seem that, for the most part, people turn off their phones. They often have to be reminded, but it is a space where people still gather. And I guess going back to my point about MT Live, it's interesting that the sort of event cinema or alternative content, this kinds of people being able to access this stuff as a social event in cinemas has been much more successful than when things have been tried online, and it's still a very isolated experience because I think we have so many interactions with technology which can be really isolating these days. And I think one of the reasons MT Live and other things like it have been successful is because people still like to go out together and have a social experience. And those things, although it's not at all, it's never going to be the same exact thing as going to the theatre, but it still is that kind of interaction. And I hope that the more that plays like this and other plays start to, and new forms of theatre making and storytelling arise, that people will explore those questions, and actually theatre and kind of communal experiences of art will be a really good forum for actually maybe exploring and digging deeper into those questions.
Brilliant. Who else would like to ask a question? Oh, let's start with that lady down there.
Hi. I have a question that goes more towards technology on stage. And I was wondering what your opinions were on creating something like holograms or projections to interact in the play rather than real life actors, and how you potentially see the future of that.
Brilliant. So this is a question about the idea that with sort of holographic technologies and 3D projections that perhaps we'll be able to replace real actors. David, I'm going to...
Well, I mean, yeah, I think it's I think it's a really interesting question. I'm thinking there's a number of different ways possibly to answer it. But I guess, although theatre is, in some ways, and a play like this in many ways is incredibly still traditional, fourth wall, you know, this is the experience, and the audience is here and they're watching a story that's being told, but clearly in the design elements of it, it's using lots of new technology in terms of the video and in terms of the projection work, and you've seen that, you know, progress a great deal over the past few years, but, you know, technology is not something which is new to the theatre, and then there's lots of theatre artists who've incorporated video work, whether that's Katie Mitchell or the Worcester Group, or, I mean, there's huge amounts of live filming and different work that's involved. I think, again, it kind of, I can't see why there wouldn't be a world in which that there's a story or production performance where that's interesting. Do I think it's going to become a trend or a phenomenon? Probably not. I think it's kind of back to me, it's back to what Tassos was saying about, it's less about the technology and all about the experience. So if someone finds a great way of telling a story or creating a piece of theatre which does use holograms instead of actors, that sounds like it could potentially be interesting, but it ultimately comes back to the artist having a great idea and finding the best medium in which to tell their story. That's my best.
Brilliant. Tassos, have you got anything you'd like to...
I mean, what David said, and what, I mean, it kind of comes down to why, like, and if it's being used in a way to become like a cheap substitute to kind of try to reproduce qualities that another, like, technology, and I mean that in the very broad sense, you know, people are at the technology, then that's probably a mistake. But if it's doing something which can only be explored by using that, then it becomes interesting. And
For
there's...
example, if you think about this play, I've seen it before and discussed it with a few people. For example, if you take the character of a child, a few people say, how can you put a child of that age into a character like that? So what if users were created in habits for the potential of maybe having that particular character as a hologram, or it would take away the actors?
It would have been terrible. It would have been absolutely terrible.
Okay, but
Because what the play does so cleverly is special effects through your imaginative engagement with who you're looking at, and obviously it plays several times with a reversal of your understanding as to who you've just watched and seen, and that's why the play works. If you had done it would have been a very poor version, a very poor simulacra of a real person, and so the whole thing would have immediately fallen apart because you would never have suspended your disbelief. It's been traditional in theatre and in technology generally for at least 20 or 30 years to see into the future and assume that increased realism is going to come, and that as technology gets better and better and better, there will be perfect robots and perfect virtual environments and so on. And some people believe that we will reach a singularity where it's impossible to distinguish between the real and the virtual world. That's not ever going to happen. It's a complete myth. It's easy to assume that things will get more and more realistic until you can't tell the difference. But that's really to misunderstand how humans interact. We have a very, very, very good way of telling the difference between real and simulated things.
There's actually there's a phenomenon called the uncanny valley, that the kind of closer you try to get to representing the real, then we actually become, it starts to bother us more, like the differences, however small those might be, become kind of increase in our perception. So it's really, really hard to do that, and it does come down to what you're doing is in order to sort of divert from another question. But the kind of question, why are you doing this? Which is like, why is it being represented in this way? Which, as Matt said, because of what it's doing in your imagination. That's the important thing.
Yeah, I mean, there's the thing about we wanted that world to be as real as possible, and also I think a brilliant thing about the way this production is conceived is this sense that the most advanced technology you can think of is in some ways retro in its kind of expression on stage. And also this idea that the world outside in the play, the real world, has become so degraded that actually it's only in a virtual world that you're able to have a sort of a sense of sort of beauty, which then sort of brings this kind of sense that this world is more real now to you than the world that you would have to face if you were if you were looking outside. Brilliant. Let's go for the gentleman just behind there. Yeah.
Hello. On the back of what my learned colleague in the front row said, I believe cynically that the public are very aware of the way they're seduced by technology. On occasion I have to visit offices, and in many places below the fire escape sign there's a small sign that somebody's put that says, in the event of a fire, would you please leave the building before telling everybody on social media. Secondly, on the back of the gentleman there, the financial services issue, that sounds, I knew nothing about it, and after just being explained in a very, very small amount of time, I would pay lots of money to be involved in it. I think it's fabulous.
£12.
Thank you.
Play now?
tinyurl.com /adventure1 Coney.
Thank you. And finally, sorry, three-part question. Finally, the Karen thing. Totally fucking insane. Mildly scary. Can you summarise and tell us a little bit more about it?
Great, Matt, can you tell us a little bit more about Karen?
Hooked. Totally.
Yeah, so it's played. The role is played by an actress, so it's video. So when you open up your phone, you're looking into Karen's world, and she's looking straight at you, and she assumes that you've come for life coaching, and for the first couple of days, she's quite professional. She's recently out of a very painful breakup, and she's got this new enthusiasm for life. She's decided that she's got a new career. She's going to be a life coach. She's got a little bit of psychological knowledge, but just enough to be dangerous. And it quite quickly becomes clear that the boundaries between Karen's professional life and her personal life starts to break down. And you call and you find her, with her flatmate who's playing computer games in his bedroom naked, and you find her out and about, doing things that she shouldn't really be doing. So you kind of she gets a very intense friend crush on you, and naturally that can't end well.
How does this generate a revenue stream?
The app is free, but at the end of the experience, you're able to buy a report that shows how you interacted with it, what we did with how you interacted, and then what the science is that underlies that. So all of the psychological personality profiling techniques that we're using. We've worked with a scientist called Dr. Kelly Page, who's based in Chicago, and she is a specialist in this area, and so she's writing a report that will be personalized to you that shows how you score on these various tools and where they originate from. And of course, if you go back far enough, the history starts in the Second World War with the Secret Services trying to recruit people.
There's a lady in the front row here.
Yeah, I was just wondering how you feel the current theatre technologies you're all currently working on, especially things like NT Live, are engaging with the current debate that arts are just privileged, and how they're making it more accessible or maybe hindering them.
Brilliant. So how are new technologies making the arts more accessible to perhaps the less privileged? Or how might they actually be hindering it? So David, I'll pass it over to you.
I think certainly, I can't speak for everyone, but as an organisation, it's something that is always of concern to the National, and you think about it in all different ways, and technology or what we're doing with digital is just one of them. We definitely see it's slightly limited what we capture about who's coming to see NT Live, because it all happens sort of through the cinema, but we've done bits of research, and what we've definitely seen is it's quite production specific. So some productions, as you would expect, programming in different ways will attract different kinds of audiences. But we are definitely seeing that we are getting audiences who haven't come to the theatre as frequently, and in some cases audiences who it may be their first time because there's a lower psychological barrier, because there's a lower ticket price possibly, because geographically they just don't have the access to theatre, and that's kind of what NT Live is about. So in some ways I think it's really encouraging, and certainly on projects we've done that may be less conventional than NT Live, that have been more interactive installations, front of house, more sort of transmedia or storytelling, which has existed across both live events and digital technologies, we are finding that we are sometimes attracting, again, it very much depends on the project, but I can think of instances where we certainly have attracted audiences who we think we struggle to get through the doors in other ways. So on the whole, I feel like it's positive because it's trying to create new experiences, particularly for people who might not be as prone to going to a more traditional or conventional theatre going experience.
Yeah, so just quickly, I mean, there clearly are some barriers with technology, and you are immediately, when we say everyone has a mobile phone, I think we all understand that not everyone has a mobile phone. We've done, one of the reasons that I'm working in this way is because I grew despondent about spaces like this as a place to reach different audiences, and I felt that that the buildings themselves have such a degree of conservatism and expectation around them that it's very difficult to tell new stories in new ways there. And there has been examples. We did a project for Channel 4 a couple of years back where we specifically made a piece of work for SMS because their research showed that they couldn't reach some teens in any other way than SMS. SMS was the one platform that they had, and so we were able to engage a really different kind of audience in it with an interactive SMS drama. So it depends what you're trying to do, and I think there are places where digital really extends reach, and there are places where it clearly doesn't.
Yeah, I think in some ways, again, it's not really about the technology. It's about like starting out with an eye on what the barriers are and what the kind of encouragements are for people to engage in a piece of work, and the barriers, and with the culture, with a building, the barriers are manifold, economic, psychological. The single biggest barrier to people sort of participating in an activity is a fear of being judged. And that, you can think about that in terms of like the kind of traditional audience participation anxiety, but it's also about, there was a research study which I read 10 years ago and hugely influenced me in terms of like what it is for young people who've not been to the theatre before to come to the theatre and find that a structure like this, an architecture like this is very intimidating, and it's full of people who are a lot older, who are not like them, and who they expect they're going to tell them off, often because they are telling them off, because they expect they're going to misbehave, and that's a bigger barrier. And I think, sort of part of the kind of because of the audience focus that Coney's work has, we're sort of like used to processes of like starting off by not just with the artistic idea what we want to do, but who is it for, who's it going to reach, how is it going to reach them? And don't just assume that if you build it, they will come. Like, you need to find ways to bridge and make journeys for people to be able to kind of engage with work. And I don't think there's any real excuse for not thinking about that. And it's in thinking about that, having that consideration at the start, and then seeing how digital technology might be a toolbox for some audiences, but not for others, maybe a barrier for others. I mean, this Adventure 1 is kind of currently contingent on you having a smartphone, and we know that does limit it a little bit, but there's kind of, right now, there's no way around that. But with that awareness and being clear about it, then you can, because we can build whatever we like, that's the point. We can make events happen anywhere, take any shape, for any group of people, so, it's up to us.
Brilliant, so I think I've got time for 2 more short questions. Oh, I might take someone from the back, the lady with the blonde hair.
Hello. Obviously, with a play like this, you've got a certain amount of social responsibility that goes with, presenting something such as this subject to your audience. And I just wondered how you felt with regards to your social responsibility with your apps. I mean, you were discussing about an app that deals with psychologically profiling someone. With the theatre, your audience is in front of you. It's tangible, they're right there. With an app, you don't know who's buying your product. So how do you feel with regards to your social responsibility of producing something like that? And again, with the other gentleman, do you know who you're bringing in to making a foobar of the financial system? And believe me, I'm all for that.
That's brilliant.
So,
Yeah, I don't.
Oh, sorry, I'm just going to rephrase the question.
Sorry,
This is a question about social responsibility and how it's sort of in the theatre, you can see the people in front of you, you can perhaps judge the kind of effect that something is having on them, but with an app or a technology-based audience, you may have no contact with them. So how do you think about social responsibility towards your audience in those terms?
So I suppose it's to do with the hybrid nature of what we're making, which is that it's in some ways, I mean, in fact, making an app is really very much more closer to film or TV production or making a website than it is to theatre. It's really moved, you know, it's going right across to that wing because it's not a live experience. You know, the social responsibility is the same, I think, that you have as a creator in any context, which is about thinking very carefully about the effects that you might have on people and paying close attention to that. One of the sort of inherent parts of the work that we make is that you build little trials and little test versions, and you try that with a small group of people, you study that, you learn from that, you listen to those people, and you iterate, and you do that over and over and over again. It's more like games design in that respect. And so what it means is that we actually look in great detail at a small group of our audience. We're working with the University of Nottingham on this project, and they will do an ethnographic study. In fact, there are 4 pieces of research that will go around the Karen app, and one of them is an ethnographic study, which is looking at 10 players, asking them to keep diaries, looking at the logs of how they've played, doing interviews with them, building up a really detailed picture. So in some ways, we know more than theatre people who, you know, might have the audience in front of them, but it may be a less detailed set of knowledge.
Yeah, I mean it's exactly that. I mean I think it's a design process, and it's about kind of engaging people in that and learning from like responses. So Venture One is already like been through a play test and a scratch with kind of like friendly audiences, like but in order to learn very much kind of what's going to be going on through the experience. It's also about design principles to, I mean actually Coney has at its heart, its ethos, a principle of loveliness. And that isn't actually about being like sort of sickly sweet. What that means is about a principle of taking very great care and consideration of the people that are going through the experiences and like being very mindful about what might happen. And it's important precisely because of what you said, that there's a kind of otherwise perhaps a danger of something can happen which like can have kind of like suddenly a disproportionate impact because it's happening in a kind of an uncertain frame. So we need to work harder, like to not just don't do evil, but also take really good care to kind of ensure that. But I also think, like Matt, I mean, we know who our audience are. Like, we could go because we see them sign up. We've got, in effect, and in terms of the way that the kind of experience starts, we're building an individual relationship with each one of them. So in some ways, we know much better, like where they're at, and we're designing it in a way to make it really clear, to kind of like sort of how people can step out and like what they need to do.
I'm just interested in that because you say you know who signs up, but I've just watched a play where somebody thought a small girl turned out to be a 65-year-old man. So do you actually know who your audience is?
He does.
Yeah.
Just checking.
Yeah, he does.
Yeah, thanks for answering that for me.
They've got particularly good encryption technology in the Hideaway. I think that's probably impossibly good.
But it's also just to add, like, there is a kind of principle that anybody who is kind of pretending to be somebody other, like, the amount of steps that somebody's got to go through before they go anywhere near, like a live thing, most people who are trying to, like, play it in some way would give up, because it's just they're not getting anything from it. So it's partly a design process by which you filter out the people that kind of don't really want to be there.
David, how do you think about social responsibility in terms of the work that you're doing at the National?
Well, I think, because the majority of my work, although we have a few sort of discrete projects, but they tend to be more things that are in development, so it's slightly different from what Matt and Tassos are doing. But I think it's about opening up the conversation. I mean, we are very, very active around NT Live and around other projects that we've done and certainly through the different channels we have communicating with people. It really is about engaging in the conversation with audiences. So particularly when you have, like you're doing here, when you have something which engages a subject which raises those kinds of questions, then I think it's just about being really open to the conversation and taking the responsibility to, if you're going to be willing to program it and stage it, then you also have to be willing to engage in the conversation around it. So, and bring, open up the dialogue to it. So.
Okay, time for one last question. I'll go for the girl in the yellow jumper.
Yeah, I have a question sort of about what I consider to be kind of the core of the theatrical experience, which is this idea of liveness, right? The idea that something could go wrong. The actor that swung the axe, it could slip out of his hand. Something could happen. And I think that also plays into the relationship with the audience, and that audience is not only watching something and receiving something, but they're also giving something back, right? There's an exchange between the performers on stage and the people in the audience. So I'm interested to hear your perspectives about this idea of liveness and how it's changing and how you're playing with that, kind of using these different technologies, and how maybe through broadcast or through live stream or through apps or whatever the platform may be, how that relationship with liveness and the audience's own experience and how they give back to the performance is changing.
So this is a question about liveness and the idea of live performance as a two-way event that creates a relationship between performers and spectators, and just thinking about how you all are thinking about liveness as in your work with digital technologies. Brilliant. I'll pass that to David first.
That's all right. Well, I think it harks back slightly to what I was saying. So in the case of NT Live, the reason why we haven't distributed in other ways and why we're really passionate about cinema, it's the shared experience, the communal experience, but it's also the liveness. Now, as I say, it's interesting that we had a question over whether the encores would be as successful or whether we played it in Australia 2 weeks later, was that taking something away from it? And what I found is, because there's only one instance where we actually haven't filmed something and broadcast it live, even if it's then had repeats. And there was a difference on that, because it didn't have quite the same residue somehow as something which, even though you might be watching a week later because you live in a different time zone or because it's been repeated, but actually you know that it went out live and it sort of left something on. And so I think that's been an interesting lesson for me, and I do think that NT Live in that sense has been successful because it bears some of the, what I'd call the DNA of performance, of theatre, and what makes it special, and exactly what you're talking about. Now, we've also just made our first feature film, which is an adaptation of London Road, which was a piece of performance we were so proud of and so excited about, and we think it's a special story that needs to be seen, and actually Rufus Norris, the director of the National Theatre, is a brilliant theatre director, but also a great film director, and felt like something we absolutely wanted to be attached to, and the reason we also wanted to stay involved is because we have a relationship with the audience, so we think the audience who go see NT Live will also be interested in seeing this film adaptation, but it isn't theatre, it is something else. And when we're looking at different digital projects, I think it does often come back to that question of who are we? We're a theatre. And that's not to say that I think we can't in today's world. These things are crossing over, and there's hybrid and there's blended experiences. So why can't we make something which ultimately does come closer to film or television or in that realm? But a project we did with a company called Body Data Space, who are a London-based sort of digital arts collective, was you had 4 different cities. It was a sort of installation in the foyer of the National Theatre, and there was 3 other cities, Istanbul, Paris, and Brussels, which had a similar kind of portal that you would go into, and you saw a sort of avatar or a silhouette of yourself on the screen, and it was in real time connected to it. And the thing that really interested me about the technology, although it really wasn't theatre in some ways, it was just a kind of simple movement piece in some ways, but it was the liveness. It was the fact that you were in a space and you were seeing the silhouette of someone in another city who was a different color, and you could interact with them physically in that space. And it felt like the learnings from that project could be really interesting for theatre makers in ways that we hadn't yet explored. So.
Brilliant. Tassos, you got the microphone.
I think, liveness is is quite a tangled up word. There's a lot of things at play in liveness. Like, we were at a live event at the theatre tonight, but the liveness here is about both for you, the audience, and well, for us, the audience, because we were up there, the kind of sense of being part of kind of like a communal, like, responsive, like we're picking up the response of everybody else kind of around us. There's something about the kind of responsiveness the performance has to our presence. There's something about presence and the kind of quality of what that feels. There's something about the connection and the connection to the sense that this is happening just now for us. And the kind of the flip of that, because I think, mishaps are wonderful. Like, and when things go wrong, that is the moment when we kind of really feel the liveness. I don't think that technology per se, like, takes any of those away. It just treats them in a very different way, and you also have to be very mindful of them. Of course, you can, a lot of work that we're used to being technologically mediated is not live at all. But an email conversation that you have with somebody who is properly responding to you is live in the sense of responsiveness. And I mean, if you ever work with technology, you will always go wrong. And the thing, so there are some really exciting moments when there have been total mishaps, but because the audience had been able to, like, find agency themselves to fix it, like, to find another way to hack around it, then there's actually it feels kind of triumphant. The problem with technology around that side is because it's quite opaque. If something goes wrong, you don't know what that is. It's really hard to do something about it, and then that's kind of where the disengagement kind of happens. But I think there's so much bundled into it that we've got to be kind of careful to pick apart and not just make the assumption because what you're getting now for me is like kind of you're getting liveness in lots of different channels, like, because like all the different like sensory modalities. I'm an ex-psychologist, so I can't help but think about this. But we can have a more limited, like, if I'm just emailing you, that is still a live conversation. It's still got qualities of that you will make that will feel that. And just being able to distinguish what we mean by it, I think, is important.
Matt?
Yeah. So I mean, I would sort of share that and give the example of gameplay. If you just think about even just two people playing noughts and crosses, it's the most live experience in some senses because both of you are feeding off each other very directly. And then you can think how computer games where you've got tens or hundreds of thousands of people who are playing simultaneously, those are incredibly live experiences, even though they are very technologically mediated. So there's a real spectrum right across the board. In fact, there's a great book, which you may know, called Liveness by Philip Auslander, and he brilliantly points out the way in which TV used to be live, in that literally a man in a dinner jacket came and stood in front of a camera and said, "Hello, this is the BBC," and that was broadcast instantly. So these things, it's a spectrum right the way across. The thing that I go back to is a book by Peter Brook called The Empty Space, which was written in the mid-60s about the fundamentals of theatre. And what he points out is that for theatre to happen, you need a performer, an audience member, here and now. Those four elements are the core of the theatrical experience. And he did amazing theatrical experiments of going back to the most basic things to sort of reinvent theatre. If you think about how technology is changing all four of those different elements and stretching them. The notion of where here is very different when you have the internet. The notion of now is quite strange as well, because even when you watch something live on television or NT Live, you're actually watching something that happened several seconds ago, or could even be longer ago than that. There's all kinds of latencies in the system and so on. So technology is transforming all of those things. What we are looking to do is find those new sparking moments of liveness that are made possible by technology.
Brilliant. Thank you all very, very much for coming, and thank you for your brilliant questions. And I'd just like to thank our panellists for coming and answering those brilliant questions.